a state right now. The second point that I want to make is that there is an emerging set of ideas and strategies around local economy building, most of which are not being done in this state, and ought to inform how one rethinks economic development here. So let's first talk about the strengthening case for local living economies. I've just finished a 2-year study for the Kellogg Foundation on what does economic development really look like around the United States. We looked at 3 largest economic development programs in 15 states. Some of the states we only had data for a year, some 2 years, some 3 years. In all, we looked at 84 program years in these 15 states. Vermont, by the way, was not one of them. If you ask the question, in what percentage of the programs spent a majority or more of the money on locally owned business, the answer is fewer than 10% of the programs. 90% of the programs are spending most of their money on attraction or retention of outsider-owned businesses. And in most of those cases, it's well over 90% of the money. Is this money going for the right thing? I would argue no. And when I say no, I'm not saying that there's anything that's bad or nasty about these global businesses. Frankly, from an economic development standpoint, I think the philosophy ought to be welcome everybody. But in terms of public money and energy, it ought to be focused laser-like on what we know works best. And that is local living economies. Now, why do I say that local living economies have a better economic development punch than do outsider-owned businesses? Let's look at 3 reasons to start with. The first is locally owned businesses are more reliable. They do not have ambitions to move to Mexico and Malaysia. I think a nice illustration of the impact of that comes from a debate that I had with the head of economic development for Lane County, Oregon, about 6 years ago. And I was very fortunate that before our debate, the local newspaper, the Register Guard, presented data on the performance of his economic development activity over about 5 years. He had given out several $1 million of tax abatements over this period. 95% of the tax abatements went to 6 non-local businesses. 3 came, took the benefits, and within a year or 2 shut down and moved to Asia. 2 came, took the benefits, and under-delivered the jobs that they promised. And 1 was sort of on target. The other 5% of the tax abatements went to about 100 local businesses. They made very modest promises and by and large kept the promises that they made. The bottom line that's demonstrated by this graph here is that in tax abatement terms, the cost of a local job was $2,000. The cost of all of the jobs generated over the 5-year period from the non-local attraction was $22,000. But remember, some of those jobs came and went. So if you looked in net job terms at the end of the 5 years, it was $67,000 a job, 30 times more expensive to get a job from outside attraction than local indigenous development. Now, is this just bad luck for Oregon? I don't think so. And I almost guarantee you that if you did a similar analysis of the cost effectiveness of Vermont's economic development programs, you would find an equivalent disparity in what the relative efficacy was of a dollar spent on a reliable business that's going to stay here for many years, if not many generations. circulates locally, the faster that it circulates without leakage, the more income, wealth, and jobs. That's economic development 101 in a nutshell. It just so happens that local businesses do this far more effectively than non-local businesses. And this is kind of the granddaddy study done 6 years ago by Civic Economics on this question, looking at the impact of 2 bookstores in Austin, Texas, a proposed